Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum for various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Jimena Hurtado, who has written one of the response essays for our October 2020 forum on Bernard Mandeville and F.A. Hayek. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors of this forum, or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. Jimena Hurtado is a full professor of economics at the Universidad de Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. She specializes in the history of economic thought, particularly the works of Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Bernard Mandeville, and other 18th century thinkers. She has been a visiting scholar at Stanford University and the Universidad de Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala City. She's written numerous articles and book chapters on 18th century and 19th century economic thought. And she is the co-editor with Pedro Garcia Duarte of the Journal of the History of Economic Thought. And she's also contributed to Liberty Fund's website, Adam Smith Works. Jimena, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's been great having you participate in this forum, and I've really enjoyed the forum quite a bit, and I've learned quite a bit about Mandeville. And I think Mandeville's one of these thinkers that has been rather unfairly characterized based on the fable of the bees as a sort of what we'd say in English, a one-trick pony, someone who focuses on vice as the way to manage societies. But in your essay, you've got a lot of interesting things to say about how Mandeville talks about structuring other parts of society and creating civil stability. Now, I've explored with some of the other authors their thoughts about comparing Mandeville to, say, Adam Smith or to Hobbes. But with you, you have written, particularly you've got a fairly well-known article from 2004 comparing Mandeville, Smith, and Rousseau. And I'd like you to take a couple of minutes and walk our viewers through how you view Mandeville and Rousseau as comparisons and how they might or might not fit together as compared to Mandeville's more contemporary thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment.
So actually, the comparison I made between Mandeville, Rousseau, and Smith comes from a letter that Adam Smith wrote to the Edinburgh Review, where he presents Rousseau as a follower not only of the so-called selfish hypothesis that would link him to Hobbes, but especially linked to Mandeville. So what Adam Smith says is basically Rousseau is saying the same things that Mandeville did, but he performs this magic sort of alchemy where what Mandeville was proposing becomes something that is really enticing and something that is attractive and something that speaks to people. So instead of these succès de scandale, as Hayek presented Mandeville, well, actually, he becomes a very liked character, but in the form of what Rousseau is trying to say. So Smith is saying they're saying exactly the same thing, but one is a shocking version of how vices can constitute the basis for social order, peaceful and prosperous social order, whereas Rousseau is presenting it as a possible future of harmony between these natural aspects of human nature. So there is a link, and Smith sees it clearly between both. And I think this makes it very interesting to see how the three of them are thinking about social order, which is what everybody was thinking about during the Enlightenment. So on the one hand, you have, I think Smith is right, that Mandeville is presented as this very provocative thinker, and that he is coming and like saying everything that we have done until now is just hypocrisy, and that we want to transform human beings into something they're not. And we should take human beings as they are, with their vices and their passions, and build a social order from these passions and from this passionate human nature, which is actually what Rousseau is also would be proposing, according to Smith. And Smith would say, well, we don't have to do this like binary kind of thing, like we have this passionate natural. We can also articulate human nature, and we have also the possibility of making a system of incentives, just as Mandeville has said, that will lead people to be more sociable. So we are sociable, but there are things that make us more prone to cooperation rather than to competition or things like that. So I think that there is, like, I'd recall Schumpeter, for example, who does not have a very high opinion of Smith, but who says, well, actually, the problem with this Scottish professor is that he owes more to Mandeville than what he would like to acknowledge. And I think that's interesting because it makes like a whole thing that is saying, well, all these three characters, very important, very influential characters during the Enlightenment, have something in common. And it is that actually they're trying to find the basis of a social order of coordination and cooperation between human beings based on human beings, on their character, on their behavior, rather than from any authority that would be coming from elsewhere.
Now, that's interesting because I tend to think of Rousseau, and maybe I'm getting Rousseau wrong, but as someone who is much more in the camp of sort of shaping human desires, trying to remove vice, trying to rewrite the desires of the human heart, and doing so through an instrument, for example, for the general will, in such a way as to try. I mean, maybe I guess the distinction is something like there are truer or more honest motivations that people have, according to Rousseau, that they're simply unaware of. But I tend to group Rousseau more in the category of people who want to sort of repress these vices. Am I mistaken, or is
No, I think
is your
that's a possible reading. But the thing is that as Rousseau has been read, he's mostly read as this like totalitarian kind of thinker. So there's the general will who will dictate what we are supposed to do. But there's a part in the social contract where Rousseau is very clear in saying, well, actually the thing is that there is a part of our behavior that should be dictated by the general will, which is nothing else than our own will as citizens. And there is this other part of our behavior, which is private behavior, where the general will should say nothing, should be quiet. This part we have kind of lost in our translation to contemporary thinkers in Rousseau. That's the first thing. And then the second thing that I think it's important is that how we read Rousseau today, or mostly how we read Rousseau during the 20th century, is not the same way as Rousseau was read during his time. So now we have this image of Rousseau as the thinker of the general will, of this totalitarian kind of aspect of organization of society. But at the time, he was not so well known for having written the social contract, but rather for having written his novels, La Nouvelle Héloïse and Emile. And these are like kind of novels where he is trying to recover what he would call natural human being. But if we pay attention to those natural human beings, actually they are quite, and let me make the difference because the difference was made in the forum also, between unnatural and artificial. So not necessarily the fact that something is artificial makes it bad in Rousseau. But unnatural is something that is undesirable. So that's a difference in which he's trying to propose these ways of forming these individuals, Julie and Emile, La Nouvelle Héloïse, and education, where he's trying to form them in this, he's forming them. So that's artificial from the beginning. And he is trying to provide this sort of education where there is independence and there is freedom understood as autonomy, which is for him completely different from independence or from the fact that we are depending on the opinion of others. So the opinion of others is going to play a very important role, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But then what he's trying to do is, in these two characters, actually these two characters don't work very well, you know, because then Rousseau writes this other novel, Émile ou Les Solitaires, where he never finished it. It was not really published. He died. And it's the continuation of Émile ou l'Éducation. And there, actually, Émile doesn't work. This model of individual who has been raised in a certain way to be this citizen and leader is completely disconnected from his times. He's completely disconnected from his society. So he's this kind of virtuous kind of individual, but that does not fit. And not fitting is very costly for Émile. And he ends up all alone, completely alone, really, in a very faraway island in the middle of nowhere, where he kind of loses himself and he becomes kind of mad and everything. So it's a very sad story. And that's a story from Rousseau that we kind of missed during the 20th century, and especially after the French Revolution. Because after the French Revolution, we have him as a political thinker. And this political thinker who is saying, well, it's the general will, and there are some individuals who can speak in the name of the general will. This is kind of strange for a person who's saying, well, we have to grow up and fit into our society. And this fitness is what I find that grows a line of continuity between Mandeville, Smith, and Rousseau. Fitting into our society means that we grow up and we become sociable and we build our identity with others. And I think that is a very powerful notion, even if they don't agree on the details, but they do agree on the fact that there is this kind of common humanity from which we can build a social order without the interference of exterior authority. And that's very powerful, I think.
So now you have me thinking about a sort of different line of questioning. So it seems to me that what Andreas Brocchi might be referring to as honor, what you refer to as virtue, that these are and again, putting economists in the conversation, which Dario does, and also references Hirschman, and I'd like your thoughts on that piece as well. I don't know if you noticed that, but Dario in his response references Albert Hirschman, who we both have read at some length. But are we really just talking about a relational nature in which norms and practices that are not self-interested evolve through human interaction? And so in that sense, those three thinkers all share that perspective. It's just how the material that comes out and how it should come out and what the best society is all about here. Is that sort of where we're headed with this?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the relational aspect of how we build societies is like the core of what they're thinking. And what they want to bring in also determines what we come out with, right? So their view of human nature is always pivotal in what we're mixing, in this alchemy that Smith is identifying in Rousseau. So let me start separating the three thinkers. So first we have Mandeville, who's talking in the language of his times, because I think it's very important for him to be understood and be understood using that language. So people are denouncing luxury, right? And are denouncing trade and are denouncing the market as the ways that corrupt the human nature and human behavior, and we become vicious. So that's what they're talking about at the time. And he's saying, well, let's like redefine the terms. I'll be using the terms you're using, but to show you that those terms are actually have to be changed. So we have to change the terms we're using. And that's, I think it's very powerful, because he's saying, well, we're talking about vices, but are they really vices? Is this acquisitive passion that has been described and talked about since Aristotle, say, is this acquisitive passion really that terrible? Is it that awful? Is it that vicious? And he's saying, well, no, actually it isn't. Because there's this part that we kind of miss in Mandeville too, and it's the coma, right? He's saying the coma, private vices, public benefits, and there's a coma. So, and that's very important, I think, because he's saying it's not public, he's not saying private vices are public benefits. He's saying there's a connection, and we need to explore that connection.
Well, if that
why is he saying private?
Go ahead, continue.
Exactly. So that's the thing. Why is he saying private vices? Because that's the terms we used at the time. And he's saying, well, let's redefine these terms. How can we redefine terms? We can also see the coma and see that there's something that's happening that turns private vices into public benefits. And that's the kind of the difference I was making with artificial and unnatural.
Is that so? In that sense, that private vices, comma, public benefits, would that be similar to saying, so this is a language issue for you, that vice, so are you saying that sort of like when Smith says he's using sympathy in a sort of new and exciting way? So is Mandeville using vice in such a way that it was used at the time, but we would think of it more as self-interest?
We would think, yeah, self-interest. We would think about it in the terms of Hirschman, for example. He's talking about passions, right? That's a kind of weird term for us now. And I think self-interest is just that way that we neutralized in time what then was understood as vices or passions or the unruly nature of human beings. And like they're saying, well, it's not really an unruly nature. It's just that we don't kind of understand it because we're not looking at it. We're looking at how, and this is something that Rousseau says too, we're not looking at human beings as they are, but as we wished they were. How do we wish they were? Well, virtuous. This very nice kind of people who love each other, who do things for each other just because they're so nice. And he's like, well, yeah, sure, there's people who are very nice, but do we really want everybody to be so nice? And that's Mandeville too. Mandeville's in the fable. He's saying, well, if everybody was this nice, we would go bankrupt.
Right.
That's a very powerful message at the time. If we want everybody to just be austere, well, there will be no demand and there would be no production and there would be no wealth. Is that really what we want? So he's kind of asking us to be coherent. If we want to grow, if we want development, if we want people to have better life conditions, then we have to accept this kind of thing that before we thought unruly, the passion to acquire stuff. And that's okay. It is okay if we have a system of incentives that can make us work in coordination, in cooperation, the market. So if we respect, like, for example, property rights, if we do not steal from each other, that kind of things we have to. So what Mandeville is proposing, we will have a system of rewards and punishments that when a vice becomes a crime, it is punished. And the big difference, I think, between Mandeville and Smith is that Mandeville does not have really an explanation of where the system of incentives comes from. And he says this much like Bentham, for example. He'd say, well, punishments and rewards are just set by an authority. Whereas Smith will say there is the sympathetic process that will make us agree upon, focus on certain rules of behavior And those rules of behavior develop from our own interactions. I think that's the part that's missing actually in Mandeville, which is not that clear, at least.
If I may, for one moment, because we're slipping a little bit into Smith versus Mandeville, and I think that's a fascinating topic, and we could probably sit here for 2 or 3 hours and talk about. I know you could, and I almost certainly could too. But I wanted to sort of turn back to this question of, you were talking very much about the economics of Mandeville and the economics of Smith, and I wanted to veer away a little bit about social order towards the economics, because you are our only official practicing, a fully practicing economist. I say that as a Catholic who's practicing. So you are someone who actually does economics. Give me your reaction to Mikko's and Dario's essays, where they are challenging conventional, I guess what I would call conventional microeconomic, the sort of the fundamentals of basic microeconomics, and give us your reactions to the characterizations they make, and also talk a little bit about how a Mandevillian system would return us, and I think Andrea talks quite a bit about this, would return us to a richer understanding of economics that would have been much more common during the 18th century than the one we have today, which seems a little barren to a lot of folks.
So I think the problem here, and the problem, well, at least which I identified in the discussion we were having in the forum, has to do with rational choice theory, right? So rational choice theory is this model that allows economists, mainstream economists, to think about human behavior. It's not a description of human behavior, it's a model, it's a way of thinking about something. So that's very important, because economists are not saying like people are like this, but they're saying this is like a shortcut to think about how people think and how they decide and how they act. And it is very powerful. That's the first thing. It's very powerful because it's very flexible. So you have an individual, an economic agent actually, a decision unit. It can be an individual, it can be a family, it can be an enterprise, it can be a country, whatever. The relevant decision unit that has preferences and that maximizes, according to some restrictions, those preferences. So it's very powerful in the sense that it's kind of intuitive, right? So you have preferences. If you think of yourself, you have preferences, and you say, I'd rather have this than that. I prefer blue than red, and I have some restrictions. So I can't have blue and red. I have to decide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allocate my resources so I can have more blue than red. That makes sense. It's not that complicated. But the thing is that, and so what I see in our discussion in the forum is how can we contribute from the history of ideas to this kind of models? And there's a lot of things that have been going on since the mid 20th century around with experimental and behavioral economics that are saying that is a very poor behavioral model. First of all, people would have to know exactly what is their order of preferences. And they don't. That's the first thing. So, and the next thing is we would have to suppose that those preferences are stable over time. And they're not. We change our preference all the time, according to new information, whatever. Maybe also there are things we don't know about ourselves, but there are things that we don't know either about the world. There's information that we would need to make these decisions that we do not have and that we do not know that we do not have. So in radical uncertainty, we cannot optimize. That's like the bottom line. So it's kind of a poor model, even as a model, to think about it. I think there are kind of two positions in our forum. We should enrich this model or we should change it. And that's a discussion that's been going on in economics for a long time now. Do we stick with it and do we enrich it? Or do we say, this doesn't work and let's do something else? It's very hard to let go of this model because it's powerful, it's simple, it's easy to understand, and it has produced results.
And
So
it
it's
lends
very
itself,
hard to give it up.
it lends itself to a methodology that's very powerful as well, and very
Exactly.
elegant.
It's very elegant. So it's hard, and it's won Nobel Prizes and all that kind of things. And it's kind of intuitive in that sense. So you can tell people, give me an example of irrational behavior. And actually you can fix everything. You can make anything fit into this model. Anything. How you choose your partner, how you decide if you have kids, how you decide on addiction. And here I'm just thinking about Gary Becker, right? So everything can be explained through this model. But I think, so this is one line. If we want to be, we have two ways in history of ideas of being relevant. One is we are enriching the same model, or we're saying, well, actually there's a lot of very important stuff that cannot be fitted into it. And I think we have both reactions in the forum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a way of saying we have to be relevant. The history of ideas has to be relevant for contemporary issues. What I think Mandeville, Smith, Rousseau are saying is we cannot enrich it more. We're just making something that is not powerful enough, that is not explicative enough. We have to change the model. And changing the model means acknowledging, like the three things I said. People change preferences. They don't know exactly what their order of preferences are. People make decisions in radical uncertainty environments. And moreover, there are a ton of influences. Us talking, for example, this creation of this building of our own identity through the society working as mirrors, and that is true in Mandeville, in Rousseau, and in Mandeville. This, what I said a little bit ago about public opinion, about how we look at each other, that is very difficult, actually not possible, to fit into this model. And then the discussion we had in the forum about the terms becomes important. Do we collapse the terms? Self-pride, self-esteem, self-love, honor, vanity. Do we collapse them all in self-interest? And then we would be in the framework of this model? Or do we acknowledge that all these terms have meanings that differ between them, and that the differences between those terms is significant? And then we cannot collapse everything to self-interest.
So at this point, if I may, I think that distinction probably is a distinction between the intellectual historians and the practitioners. So if the intellectual historians want to understand what these terms meant so that they gain more leverage over understanding what these authors are trying to say, that might be the goal of the intellectual historians. The goal of the practitioner would then be to take that information and then try to apply it within the understanding. And I wanted to transition, or we've only got a couple of minutes left here because it's been a very lively conversation. But so one of the things that I've gotten out of this forum, and I want to challenge you with this because you are the only economist, is that I was struck by the extent to which, and this is in your essay too, that Mandeville wants human beings who are not naturally sociable to have institutions that can utilize those passions to become governable. That somehow it's really not institutions for Mandeville though, is it? It's politicians have to be able to understand human passion and be able to use that. So my question to you is this: if we understand it that way, and also I think part of the problem with that you just identified very correctly about collapsing all these terms down, that's a disciplinary problem in the 20th century where we've created these different disciplines, because Mandeville and Smith and Rousseau would not have identified it as economists or philosophers. They would have identified it as intellectuals or scholars or philosophers more generally. Was Mandeville one of the first public choice economists? As someone who identified, come on, I warned you about this, slightly different terms, but is he in that sense the first person who understands that in the political realm, we have to recognize that these human vices are going to emerge and they have to be acknowledged. And this is something that I don't think Jim Buchanan or Gordon Tullock or a lot of the first generation of scholars would have noticed, because I don't think they were very familiar with Mandeville. So what do you think about that as my next scholarly article?
Interesting. Yeah, I think it has a lot of potential. Sure, that's what he's saying. I think it's very clear in Mandeville. He's saying, well, actually, in the line of Buchanan and Tullock and all these people, he's kind of saying, well, we have to recognize not only that constitutional decisions have to take into account the actual nature of those governed, but also the nature of those that are governing. So that is very powerful, because one of the things, and I'll end up with this, one of the things that I think Mandeville is attacking, and Hutchison comes to his throat and says, you're dealing with things that are like kind of not in discussion, is Mandeville is also not just trying to change the language in which the discussion is taking place, but he's also kind of telling some people, some thinkers, some intellectuals, where are you thinking from? You're thinking from this very elitist kind of position that allows you to say, well, I can be, like Bentham, the legislator of the world. But actually, who are you? And this is something he asks Shaftesbury. And he says, well, it's very easy for you to say, in the commodity, in your comfortable, noble life, what virtue's behavior is, because you do not have to deal with the ordeals of daily life, of providing for your needs. But for all these other people who make the bulk of mankind, and that's a term that Smith would use too, well, for all these other people, you're telling these people they're vicious. What's the message you're giving them? So I think it's a very powerful way also to think about exactly how public choice is made. So that's something I think that sometimes, and Mikko says this in his essay and in his interview, like the way Mandeville deals with poverty might be very shocking to us today. But there's this other message that he's giving about who is making the decisions. Who is making the decisions about social order? And should they be making it in terms of this way of telling people how should they act, which has nothing to do with daily life. And I think that has to do also with our concern about intellectuals and practitioners. Practitioners should be working with people as they are, not telling them, well, you should be rational. No, not telling them, according to the model, this is what you should do. And economists do tend to do that, right? So economists do tend to say, well, first order a solution would be this one. Our first best is this one, but then we will never be able to reach this first best because people are not acting this way. So, well, we have to comfort with the second best. And what Mandeville is saying, well, no, that's not the second best. And I think that's what Smith is saying too. What Rousseau is saying too. Rousseau is kind of more kind of perfectionist kind of thinker, but there is this idea that people are as they are, and we should build society with those people, striving for better life for everybody.
So I think you answered one of the questions about early on when you said who wouldn't want growth, or you sort of implied that. And I think the answer is those people like Shaftesbury and others who were at the top, they were elites. And as you and several other people point out in your essays, this is Mandeville's, certainly one of his great contributions is to accept people as they are, but also get down in the dirt with the poor, because he practices medicine with those folks, and he understood them in a way that was much more profound. And so we have the answer to that question. And I also would just throw one more thing in there, and I'd like to have you react to this, because I know you're in Colombia right now and we're in the middle of this pandemic. This notion about telling people the way they should act versus the way they are, this I think is becoming more and more of a relevant issue with regards to our COVID policies. Do you feel a sort of a growing disconnect? Could we use a Mandevillian moment to start to listen to what people want, even though certain policymakers think it's the wrong thing to do, to try to get more responsiveness from people on these sorts of issues?
Yes, because I think that is precisely one of the main points in this discussion is policies to work must be legitimate. And legitimacy in policies means that people understand, accept, and appropriate those policies. So you can have the best policies in the world designed, and that would be, and I'm being cynical about it, those would be designed by Bentham. And so Bentham would say, this is exactly what you should do. I know what you should do. That's kind of something that economists do a lot, right? Like, I know what we should be doing, and you knowing means nothing when you bring those policies to the terrain and ask people to follow those policies. So actually, we lack a lot of understanding about ordinary people. And I think the Enlightenment is so powerful because Mandeville, Rousseau, Hume, Smith are talking about ordinary people. And they're saying these are the people we should be talking to, we should be looking at, we should be understanding, and stop saying we from the mountains, the heights of our knowledge, know what should be done.
There's a lot of wisdom in that insight, and a lot of wisdom in the forum. And Jimena Hurtado, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to participate both in writing the forum, but also for this interview. It was an excellent opportunity to explore some things about Mandeville and other great thinkers. Thank you for your time. Gracias por todo. And I hope you have a great rest of the semester. And thanks for participating in the author interviews for Liberty Matters.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.